Going to go on down, see this Team of Reclamation mirror between Autumn, Burchett, and Paulo Vitor Damo de Rosa.
Yeah, I'm excited to commentate this, but I'm excited to learn from this as well. It's a rare treat to watch two players of this caliber square off in such a skill-testing matchup.
Yeah, absolutely. Both of these players, just absolute masters of their craft. Autumn playing this deck basically since its inception, even during Oko Standard, and Paulo coming in 10th in last week's Players Tour.
I remember back in, I want to say it's Mythic Championship 6 in Richmond, when Oko Thief of Crowns was legal, Veil of Summer was legal. The format looked very different. Autumn was still doing their very best to play Team of Reclamation back then. And no stranger to Nexus of Fate decks, Wilderness Reclamation strategies in various formats.
Right, just making a deep run, doing honest work with Improbable Alliance. Now has access to Uro, to Shark Typhoon, to these amazing tools the deck has gotten in the last 6 months.
Yeah, at this point, Autumn and Wilderness Reclamation are the most probable alliance I can imagine at this stage. And Paulo Vitor Damo de Rosa wrote a comprehensive guide to Team of Reclamation on SCG Premier. I imagine anyone who is doing well with the deck this weekend, whatever the tournament, has read that and imbibed the wisdom that the Paulo is imparting there, even if they've deviated from his own choices. And we see a very quick turn 3 Wilderness Reclamation off a growth spiral on the play here for Paulo. So immediately Autumn is on the back foot, but that's not automatically game over. There are ways to fight back, and Paulo will still have to tread carefully here.
Right, it's pretty brutal here that Autumn had basic Mountain and a bunch of tap lands to complement their growth spiral in their opening hand, because now they're incredibly far behind. Right? Look at just how this snowballed, because Paulo was on the play, had a growth spiral, was able to resolve this Wilderness Reclamation. It feels like the game's just begun and things are starting to slip away from Autumn.
It's the hidden downside of Fable Passage that ultimately you are fetching a land that taps a one color of mana, and you can choose which land that is, but at the end of the day, sometimes you draw that basic mountain when you have Simic spells in your hand, or sometimes there are other mismatches which really mess up your sequencing.
Right, and here we just see being ahead on mana means that Paulo can also interact with Autumn's developmental cards, like this Growth Spiral with his Mystical Dispute. And now he just gets to untap, grip full of cards, bunch of lands available, and Autumn's it now has to play catch-up.
And Paulo has also written about the circumstances in which you should be firing off a Mystical Dispute on that early growth spiral, on that early Uro. And this is one of the circumstances. He smells weakness here. He happily will fire that off. And I think he'll see that was the right call. So Autumn firing back with her own Uro. And Aethergust here just as a tempo play to buy time. With that Wilderness Reclamation on the battlefield, all that Paulo needs to do is leverage that as much as he can, get cards in his graveyard to escape his Uro, and press the advantage that he clearly has at this point.
Right, and we see Autumn tucking that away with the Uro with that Aethergust, now knowing that they're likely going to have to fire off a Mystical Dispute.
Right, and Paulo has the best of both worlds here. He has that game-ending explosion that he can build towards, but he also has 2 copies of Negate in case Autumn tries to fire back with a Reclamation of their own.
Autumn doing wild things like, quote-unquote, trying to participate in the game.
Doing almost fair things, dare I say.
Almost.
And Paulo calculating, do I try and play around Mystical Dispute by lowering the value of the explosion, or given that I have 2 negates in my hand, do I just fire that off and pick that fight if Autumn is able and willing to pick it?
Right, and this looks like a situation where Autumn was fine to just go ahead and try to pick a fight later on.
Absolutely, and that was not the best explosion in the world for Paulo, but it didn't really need to be. He can pick and choose a fight over something like this Reclamation, and then untap play Growth Spiral, escape Uro, and then untap his lands with the Reclamation, hold out the other negate, cycle a Triumph if he needs to. He really has a lot going on, even though he didn't hit the second explosion that would end the game on the spot.
Right, and in this particular juncture, we see that he just hit a bunch of cards that also cycle. So if these aren't the cards he wants, they can just turn into other cards.
Absolutely. And poor Paulo drawing a mostly dead Scorching Dragonfire is a hard life sometimes, being the world champion, currently on an 8-0 run in the tournament, and showing no signs of slowing down anytime soon.
God, sometimes only the first 26 things go right in a game. And, being able to power through those situations where you need 27 things to go right is exactly what has gotten Paulo this deep in the tournament.
You just have to play tight. And Paolo can escape Uro here. Even if Autumn does have an Ether Gust and is able to attempt the Gust, honestly, I think Paolo is just fine with that. He doesn't even need to fight over that because Autumn doesn't really have a good mechanism for fighting back with their own Uro or really any other favorable sequence for them.
Right. This is a situation where it really is on Autumn to try and make something happen because they're just so far behind on multiple axes that we can see Paulo almost passively pushing this advantage in a way where he doesn't have to take any sort of real gamble. He can just play everything safe. Look at that third copy of Negate that Paulo picked up. And him main decking 3 copies of Negate is a loud message here.
Absolutely. I wonder if Arena had a function to reveal your own hand, if Paolo would do that here just to keep it snappy and keep this moving.
Oh yeah, just really just a sign of respect at a certain point.
And Autumn can use one of the 2 explosions to try and resolve the reclamation. That's not going to work. And once that reclamation is countered, I think Autumn will see the running on the wall.
Yeah, it would not surprise me if Autumn's just off it at that point.
I love the Scorching Dragonfire somehow has found an actual target in that Baby Shark.
Wow, Paulo over here going ahead and casting a growth spiral before the other negate just to give that moment of hope.
So Uro can come in here. Paolo deliberating over which land to get, as if it's going to matter 1 iota to the eventual outcome. But again, keep it tight.
There's all kinds of just magical heuristics where it's kind of built into our heads from when we start playing to technically optimize everything. And also a bunch of times where you kind of look at it and go, who cares? It's the 5th red versus the 6th blue versus the 4th green. We're going to power through this. I have that feeling.
And you may as well maintain best practices even in situations like this where it's not going to matter, so that it becomes intuitive for the situations where it does, and you don't want to have to spend that mental energy going through stuff that should be second nature to you.
Exactly, you nailed it. And that's what separates the good players from the great players.
And you see one dynamic that Paolo touched on in his Team of Reclamation guide, which is that Mystical Dispute is often as good as it looks, but it's often subtly quite weak as well, where in game 1, you don't get the discount if you're trying to fight over Wilderness Reclamation. And then once the Reclamation is in play, it's likely that the dispute itself becomes dead. And you have this interesting dynamic that he identified in sideboarding, which I will see before too long, I imagine, where both players tend to have way more cards that have some kind of role in the matchup than they can put in their deck. So then the question becomes, do I want to remain a Wilderness Reclamation deck to some degree? Do I try and turn into some aggro control style tempo deck? How many reclamations, how many explosions do I keep in? What is my plan in the post-sideboard games? And the fact that there's no clear consensus about that shows just how intricate this matchup really is.
Exactly. It's just a lot of it, and we touched on this a bit earlier when people would insist that they have a good reclamation matchup. That usually came down to people being able to beat a certain build of Teamer. And what does an anti-Teamer build of Teamer look like, and how far does that scale slide?
Yeah, and Paolo's view was that you're priced into building your game one deck to acknowledge the mirror. And once you do that, what do you really gain by having more stuff in your sideboard? Like you can lose your Scorching Dragonfires and any other cards that you need to hedge against the rest of the field. But there are only so many of those cards, and so why bother making marginal upgrades to the 7th or 8th best or 8th worst card in your deck, when instead you could cover the rest of the field more comprehensively and still present a cohesive game plan for the mirror.
Right, and that's exactly what we see happening in exactly this game. We have seen a ton of negates in Paulo's hand, despite it being game one, and it's really paying off for him in a big way. It feels like he has insurance to just kind of ride this Uro to victory.
And it's not like negate is a narrow card. Sometimes that will counter a game-winning Embercleave, or you can find a use for that card against basically anyone, but this is a matchup where it is its absolute best.
Look, most spells are about 50% to be a non-creature spell, right? They either are a creature or they're not a creature, so it's a 50-50.
Absolutely. I guess with the adventure creatures, 50% of them is an instant or sorcery, and 50% of them is a creature, so maybe that's how that works?
50% of the time, it works every time.
Mm-hmm. And we are getting word as well that Louis Samuel Del Tour has taken game one from Eric Johnson, and Del Tour is the one non-Team of Reclamation deck in this top four, so maybe he's the true underdog here, at the helm of his ban strategy, which took him to the top 8 of the Player Store last weekend, which has seen continued success for him. He is the one holdout, so anyone who wants to see a different outcome to this tournament should be under Del Tour's banner here.
So it basically is Scooter as the people's champion versus Luis Samuel Del Tour as the people's real champion, right? It's just really that's the fight of the century there. Of whoever wins that is who we're rooting for in the finals.
Absolutely. So what do you make of the slightly different approaches that we're going to see these two players taking sideboarding here?
So for the most part, I would assume that Paulo and Autumn are mostly just looking to kind of bring in some hammers that are able to win games by themselves and actually lean out of the sort of incidental gain or the marginal gains that you get from things like Uro in the post-sideboard games, because if you can ever stick something like your big expansion, explosion, and so on, you just invalidate those sort of angles very, very quickly. And without an incredibly robust flash game to be able to board it into, you kind of want to keep them honest by leaving in some of your wilderness reclamations.
Yeah, I'm interested to see Paulo leave one of those Night Pack ambushes in his sideboard, where you typically the heuristic you gravitate towards is if this card is good and this card is part of my game plan, I want as many copies of that card as possible. And Paulo doesn't totally subscribe to that philosophy. And Ambusher gets better in multiples. They pump each other. They both pump wolves, so that any wolf is now a substantial threat. And often you can pick a fight over one wolf and untap and land another. But Paulo doesn't want to be clogged, I imagine, with too many threats which he has to deploy in a specific window.
Right, and in a lot of situations, you're just going to end up in a spot where you end up in this sort of counter fight, which ultimately boils down to being able to double, triple, even quadruple spell in one turn cycle. So having too many 4-drops is a real liability. And if we're at the level where we have to leave in some number of wilderness reclamation to keep them honest, then fitting all of your Night Pack ambushers is a real ask.
Mm-hmm. And if game one was something of a runaway for Paulo, this game already is shaping up to be a lot closer, and this is going to be more of the intricate back and forth chess match that we've come to expect from the mirror in these post-cyborg games.
All right, so what does a mystical dispute on Opt tell you?
So if I'm Autumn and my Opt has just been disputed, I'm thinking Paulo either has a glut of counter magic and maybe not the mana to control the pacing of the game and choose when he picks that fight.
Right, and you can see it in one of two directions, and it depends on the level these two players operate on, right? These are both obviously world-class players, and it's going to come down to if you think Paulo truly has a glut of this interaction, or if you think Paulo is going to put Autumn on the level where Autumn would have that read and wants to take advantage of that in spite of the fact that he doesn't actually have that much to do.
And that right there is a teachable moment. The fact that Paulo, who we both agree is the best player in the world right now, has been maybe for a long time, snapped off the dispute on that Opt, that should tell you something. And I would definitely recommend going back and watching this match again after its conclusion to figure out and debate and think through exactly what that would be.
Right, and the snapping it off in particular is a sort of body language that you can actually create despite not being able to see your opponent here, right? Not thinking about it at all makes it look like, oh, this is obvious. This is how I want to posture, for sure. No question.
Yeah, and Paolo and Autumn will both be giving each other a lot of respect. So I don't think there's anything to the degree of, well, I think, I can exploit my opponent by forcing them into some kind of error here. You're giving your opponent enough credit that they will be reading the mostly correct reasoning into your own lines of play, and you'll be choosing whether or not to make that play with that in mind.
Exactly. There certainly comes a point where there's almost a level of doing slightly suboptimal play because your opponent will operate on a level where they're trying to figure out why your suboptimal play would be optimal and then create that situation and so on.
Absolutely. So if you're Autumn here, would you gust this ambusher on your main phase while Paolo is tapped out, or would you try to pick a fight on Paolo's turn, knowing that you have the second gust, or knowing that you can back it up with a negate or the second gust, and that Paolo wouldn't get the trigger even if you lost the fight?
I'm fairly interested in going ahead and firing it off now. The big reason just more or less being that you sort of want to know what your cards are going to do as you cast them, and if Autumn is on the level where they're operating under the assumption that Paolo has a pile of counter magic in his hand, then you got to respect that a little bit. You need to actually compensate for that fact.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at Autumn's hand right now, this is, in a lot of ways, this feels like the kind of hand that it's not actually doing that much to stand up against this Night Pack Ambusher, and this is the type of hand that it's going to capitalize against. And now I see Autumn pivoting a little bit to actually say, all right, I need a longer-term plan against this Night Pack Ambusher. Let's go ahead and try to fight over this during Paolo's upkeep. All right, now we have Shark Typhoon for X equals 3 after Autumn serves for 2. So this is actually a way for Paolo to try and interact with what Autumn's doing on the battlefield. This is, however, going to give Autumn a window to actually try and resolve something big, like a Wilderness Reclamation. Unfortunately, it looks like she doesn't quite have anything to really punish here. And in a lot of ways, this is really just going to inform the fact that Autumn doesn't have very much going on in their hand right now. If the best thing that they can do is just shoot this creature for an expansion explosion for 1, that's an enormous signal to Paolo.
And I think Autumn's hand tells us a lot about the dynamics of this matchup, where you see Negate and Mystical Dispute, which are these your premium interactive cards in the matchup. You also see Commence the Endgame, which is a threat that can't be tagged by either of those cards. So there is a kind of inevitability to the way this matchup plays out, where, let's say, Paolo gives Autumn enough time, they can force with that Commence the Endgame to good effect. And picking and choosing how your interactive pieces line up is going to be crucial here.
Right. And now, see, Autumn tried to capitalize, go ahead, get that kind of clunky expansion explosion to cycle and answer that token. But now Paolo knows the shields are down and he kind of gets to do something back and resolve 2 Haymaker spells this turn.
So Nightpack Ambusher will come down. And it will stick. That Ambusher is making it through this turn cycle.
And this is just a really rough spot for Autumn, no matter how you slice it. So without any real way to get this Night Pack Ambusher off the battlefield, they're going to have a hard time really catching up. This is a spot where Paulo's just created several different axes to fight on at the same time.
For Paulo, would you respect the threat of something like a Shark Typhoon or commence the endgame, or would you try and get aggressive with the ambusher, knowing that if you make Autumn tap out to attempt that trade, then the coast is clear for an explosion?
Yeah, this feels like a situation where it looks like Paulo is actually, or excuse me, Autumn is trying to create a situation where Paulo is going to have to play into the shields being up by, they just didn't play a land, which in part is because they want to make a 5/5 commence the endgame token to block this Night Pack Ambusher. But that's them saying that they just don't think they can really fight over an expansion explosion that effectively at this point anyway. And it's going to basically come down to when Autumn chooses to fire off this commence the endgame.
What do you think is the most likely window for that?
I would expect them to do it during combat and just say, all right, well, Paulo didn't have that expansion explosion last turn. Let's hope he didn't top deck it this turn, because this is really the last moment that Autumn's going to have the ability to cleanly get this Night Pack Ambusher off of the battlefield.
With the information you can piece together about Paulo's hand, if you're Autumn, then if Paulo doesn't have the explosion, and we see Uro, which potentially is another strong backup threat, but if Paulo is just on, let's say, a dead mystical dispute or something, then your position is actually reasonably solid if you do get to ambush this Night Pack.
Right, this is certainly a spot where if the hand's a couple of counter spells, maybe an Aether Gust, a land off the top, something to that effect, Autumn may actually just feel like this is a good position for them to end up kind of coming back.
As it happens, though, the shields are down, and we're going to see a gigantic explosion here, potentially. And it's rough for Autumn, who just assembled Wilderness Reclamation with Negate and Dispute to force it through. If they got to untap, then this game could be looking very different.
Right, and this is a position where, in a lot of ways, it feels like Paulo is just kind of going to get to set up his hand to have whatever he wants in it.
Yeah. And this
that was a lot of lands off that expansion explosion.
Oh, geez, yeah.
That was a lot of lands. Are we looking at a Negate, a Shark Typhoon, and lands?
It does look that way, yeah. So do we have a game still?
It looks like that we have a game, because look, Autumn ripped an explosion.
Oh
my god!
I asked that before I even saw that. That is a big development. Wow. It's this odd dynamic, though, right? Because if Autumn taps out for a giant explosion, then assuming Paulo drew anything off his own explosion, then you kind of end up trading haymakers back and forth, never leaving up the negates in your own hands. We also are getting word that the Del Toro Johnson match is going to a Game 3, so we'll bring you more news on that when that develops.
Ooh, speaking of developing news, Eric Johnson forcing a Game 3 against Luis Samuel Del Toro. Really, both of those players fighting to be the people's champion of this tournament.
Absolutely, but we need to find out which overdog, if you will, is going to be facing off against them. So yeah, we see Autumn go for the big explosion, and now crossing their fingers physically and metaphorically that Paulo hasn't found that additional explosion of his own.
Right, and this is a position where, despite Autumn's explosion not being as big as Paulo's, Autumn's have gone upstairs. Autumn's still at 20, while Paulo is at 8.
So Uro here finds a mystical dispute, which, what is the value of a dispute at this point in the game? Because both players have to be cognizant of that possibility.
Look at that! Oh, look at what just came off the top of Paulo's library from this growth spiral.
So, look, you don't get to be world champion by accident, okay? Sometimes, it's kind of unfair in a way to be the best player in the world, and also, to have explosion on the top of your deck just when you need it.
This has got to be so close to lethal, and now with a negate, with a mystical dispute, with all these resources in his hand to actually kind of protect this one-shot card, and an Uro in play that Autumn kind of has to answer, you've got to feel like PV is thinking about saving it for next turn to just go for the dome and just basically just try to be the Death Star and beam Autumn in one shot.
And Autumn, well, wow, okay.
Oh no, Paulo didn't put an instep stop. Oh my gosh. We saw him shock the breeding pool. The lands untap, Autumn untaps, immediately draws another copy of Expansion Explosion.
So we're almost in a very literal mirror where both players have Reclamation and a bunch of lands in play and very similar setups in their own hands.
What is happening? This game is unbelievable. This is what Magic is about. Oh my god.
It is honestly a privilege to get to cover this game. This is one that I'm going to be going back and watching at least once after it's done, for sure.
Yeah, neither player giving up an inch here. I mean, Autumn has 2 negates, a dispute of their own. Like, it really is so hard to tell where this is going to go from here.
And completing the perfect mirror, Autumn attempts their own Uro here.
From the graveyard, no less. So this is a way to block and check Paulo's.
So if Autumn doesn't make a move towards that own explosion on their end step, is Paulo meant to attempt a small Shark Typhoon? Like, is he just meant to untap and attempt to force his own explosion? How is he meant to approach this game state?
I likely think he is kind of just priced into untapping. Maybe a small Shark Typhoon, but for the most part, I just don't feel like he can necessarily do too much here. The big reason is just look at how much mana Autumn has. They're very close to being able to cast a lethal explosion with dispute backup. So if Paulo just commits too much mana, he will literally die. Wow. The game will conclude on the spot. Thanks for playing. See you next time.
Okay, Ketchy trying being cycled here. Is Autumn looking for more tools to pick this fight with?
It's possible. It's also just that they're under the assumption that Paulo is never going to make a move that would leave him dead to an expansion explosion. So they're just kind of making the second best play of getting the most out of the mana that they have left floating in their mana pool.
There also is a case that by going for a big explosion, you turn Aethergust into a relevant interactive card, which it is insofar as if you want to fight over Reclamation, that can happen in advance. But if you think that you have the tools to win any fight, then you may as well bait the opponent into picking that one so that you can then untap and force your own explosion.
Correct.
Plus, this board as it stands.
Paulo ripping another negate. You mentioned a moment ago what a mirror this is. These players have almost identical hands. Look at this.
Unbelievable.
Autumn has an extra dispute here. Paulo has a Shark Typhoon where Autumn has a Nightpack Ambusher, but other than that, they really are just like, you think there's just some mirror behind them and they're going, oh, you know what? I would love to have those cards in my hand too. Thank you very much.
And we get to see this. We see all of the counter spells here and how they're all going to line up from each of their own perspectives. They're looking at an opponent with as much mana as you could possibly ask for and a grip full of cards, and you have to work out all the different possible permutations of what they could have, what's eliminated from what they could have based on how they've been playing the last few turns, and then even if they played the game up to this point in a certain way, then if they drew, let's say, another negate or another Aethergust or even another explosion within that one turn window, that could change everything too and render all of that prior information obsolete.
Right. It's just how many permutations of the ways that these hands could play out are there? Like, what level do you think these two players on right now? I don't have the gall to even guess.
The awkward thing for Paulo is that with Autumn being on such a high life total, it's hard for him to actually get up to a lethal explosion while defending it with all of his relevant cards and playing around dispute. Whereas for Autumn, just getting up to X equals 12 is actually somewhat easier.
Well, so we are kind of at a point where cards like Wilderness Reclamation, which we see Paulo getting another copy of and getting to move to the instep with, this is a way to make that happen because now he's actually in range of looking and breaking it up into, say, an X equals 10 and then an X equals 13 later on.
Yeah, I guess it's not a given that Paolo has to deal the finishing blow in one shot. If he can win the fight and draw 10 cards in the process, that might be just as good enough.
Jeez. Well, how do you feel about a 16-16 shark? That is the Jurassic shark.
So I'm going to make the biggest model drifter of all time, and none of my lands are tapped. I'm just playing it for free, like it's Yu-Gi-Oh.
Oh yeah, absolutely. This is just really. I'm expecting this card to see print, like just in a normal set, probably like an intro deck rare by 2021, probably winter.
And you see also how the Nightpack Ambusher that Autumn drew, excellent if you're in the earliest stages of this game and trying to dictate the pace of the game on your own terms. At this point, it is just so thoroughly outclassed by everything else that's going on that it may as well be a dead card.
Right. How do you feel about a 4/4 lining up with a 16-16? You can't even kill this shark with an explosion. You would just go for Paulo's face.
Funnily enough, there are 2 blast zones in play, and that card can't answer the shark either. It's essentially invulnerable.
Well, good news for Autumn. Both of the blast zones are on their side, so they're not going to clear this sailor out of the way.
Mm-hmm. And that sailor could be a very relevant game breaker under other circumstances. Here it might be relegated just to chump blocking duty.
Honestly, it's drawn a card, it might draw another one, and it's going to gain 16 life? That's a hell of a 1-drop.
Yeah, because if Autumn takes the attack for 16, then those disputes suddenly look like dead cards because they are so much worse at fighting over an explosion.
Is this the spot where Autumn can actually just fight over a colossal explosion? So they have 21 mana. It costs 16 to attack Paulo. And then they have... So that leaves 2 negates and maybe a dispute. So I guess they lose that fight is the problem.
So where are we in the turn cycle now? It's
we're currently in Autumn's second main.
Autumn's second main phase. Okay, so
and awkwardly enough, every time this Uro activates is just 3 more mana that Autumn has to commit to this. There's also a non-zero chance that it becomes a game of milling rather than a game of damage.
Interesting.
Or that the explosion gets pointed at the shark for 10. Huh. Because having 2 more mana does unlock at least one of these mystical disputes. Or an additional mystical dispute, but...
I guess if you have your own Uro and you have a sailor, then the sailor can keep furnishing you with cards to the point where you can win a second fight as well. So if the most pressing threat is just dying to a 16-16 flying shark, then get that off the board. And
Right, so this is a situation where, awkwardly enough, whoever blinks first loses with the expansion explosions, I think, because expansion also, while it's in hand, that half of it can represent a negate in a counterfight.
Right. If you have 2 explosions, the second one isn't necessarily an explosion. It's I'm countering your negate, and my first explosion, which is all I need, is going to win the game.
Well, but also in the dynamic where the person who hasn't cast their expansion explosion yet just has 3 negates to your 2 negates. Right.
And we see Autumn cycle Shark Typhoon for the minimum size of shark, and draw Brazen Burrow, which will get the gigantic shark, the biggest shark I've ever seen, and hope to ever see, off the table as well.
Ooh, Paulo scrying a Brazen Borrower up top.
And Petty Theft 2 can also target a Wilderness Reclamation if you think that that's going to be better for picking that fight. It's easier for Paolo to do that to Autumn, given that he has 2 explosions to their 1.
Oh, is this the moment? Is this when the fight's going to happen? We see negate on that Petty Theft on the shark.
Hey, if I'm seeing a negate being cast, I'm assuming a lot more are going to follow. I don't think this fight is ending here.
Oh, it looks like it's time to go.
So this is just bleeding mana. Okay.
Autumn is just trying to make these mystical disputes have text. 2 for winning themselves to make sure they can deal with this shark.
Absolutely. And we can confirm that Del Tor is moving on to the finals against the winner of this match. So we will have Bant Ram versus Team of Reclamation, one of the marquee matchups of the standard format, showcased here in our finals.
The only 4th negate off the top for Paulo.
This is incredible. It's every turn, one of the best possible and most interesting possible cards jumps off the top of the deck for either player.
Right, we just see, and both players have cut their bad cards, so most of the cards are good ones, right? But
yeah,
there are so many here.
Every spell is good, except, I guess, for Nightpack Ambusher, funnily enough. Or it's a land, which in some cases either cycles or scries and Castle Vantress, or helps them to pick that fight because it's more mana.
Right.
For that showdown.
Come on, y'all, just draw a couple lands in a row for once. Make this look like a normal game of Magic instead of the best thing we have ever seen, please.
And if both players just have their deck stacked full of good cards, in theory, that makes the Sailor a lot better, right? Where an activation is that much more likely to give you a tool that can swing that showdown in your favor.
And we see Paulo going to float a ton of mana.
Now, is this
he's decided it's time to make the biscuits?
Or because this is go time?
Does he even have mana to do this for 29 and protect it? Oh, wow, no.
No.
So much patience.
So for Paulo, this could come down to, I can't explosion for lethal, but I can explode to find a Shark Typhoon, make a shark, and then have to close the game via that route. Okay, and with Paulo at 8.
Ooh, Paulo putting a stop in Autumn's second instep. Looking like we're going to see a fight picked over this Wilderness Reclamation.
You're going to see a nice big stack. Now, with the Growth Spiral and the Opt, I assume you want to use those in advance of that fight so that, if you can dig towards a hard counter, an Ether Gust, or something like that, you want to know that those cards are there and have access to them.
Right. There's also a point where doing these things at sorcery speed is going to give you access to a land drop.
Yes. Or potentially a second Wilderness Reclamation. Oh, and this is relevant. Bouncing the one copy of Wilderness Reclamation on your opponent's side of the battlefield, that makes their explosion so much weaker. And so if they try and recast the Reclamation now, do we fight over that instead?
Oh, this is just... There are so many levels to this, it's hard to even tell where to fall.
The other thing, too, is... you referenced this before, but depending on the card counts in the respective decks, you might not need to explode all of them for 32. You might just need to explode them for, let's say, 20 and make them draw 20 cards, and that mode is enough to end the game itself. Here we go. It's happening. We see the battle of the alternate art negates. So Reclamation is negated. Negate is negated. The negate that is negating the negate is negated.
Say it again.
Can we go deeper? Yes,
the
we
negate
can.
That's negating the negate that's negating the negate is going to negate that's then negating the negate that... I can't do it. I tried.
Okay, so is this dispute... No, so there's 4 mana left over on Autumn's side. So this is just a way to bleed some more mana. But that leaves Autumn with 1 mana left over for their own dispute, if that is a relevant factor here.
Right, this is, I think, just Paulo trying to burn as many cards out of Autumn's hand as possible, because Autumn could theoretically just pay 3 for this as well. And then Mystical Dispute on the way back, which would force Paulo to use that expansion.
Yeah, and if, by the way, if after all of this, Autumn says, all right, I'm going to launch a big explosion at you, that's the game. Paulo doesn't have any defensive tools left.
Right, this is basically becoming a scenario where Paulo is priced into winning this fight or he will die.
Yes. And in the process, he's burned his remaining expansion, so he'll need to find another copy or find some other route to wrest control back of this game. Otherwise, he can, in air quotes, win this fight and still lose the war.
Well, I don't know if you've been watching this game. I don't think it's going to be too awful hard for him to find it off the top.
Oh, it's right there. We both know that. I'm just saying, hypothetically.
Second card down, off Uro.
He does
calling
also,
it this instant.
He does also get to scry in his upkeep, so that is 2 additional looks added if that mana difference does not matter. And Borrow comes in, and that gets disputed. So now,
all right, let's see it.
Powder goes to 1. Okay, this is it.
So many looks. We got 4 looks.
Castle Vantress. Do we get to see the scry?
Oh,
or do we have to wait in suspense?
We are looking at Paulo's side of the battlefield right now as he waits to scry.
And so is he doing the math here of does that 5 mana effectively, does that make a difference? In terms of decking Autumn with an explosion?
I think he just wants to make sure, give himself that couple minutes, just breathe, do the math. As it stands, he may, because 32 is Autumn's life total, he may just be priced into going ahead, hoping to find it off the top.
So this is kind of interesting now too, though, because with the 2 reclamations, that's 3 activations of Castle Vantress. And so with a cantrip from the Shark Typhoon, if there is a relevant card in those sets of cards, like another hard counterspell, for instance, then maybe the game continues.
Right, and now, even without cycling the Shark Typhoon, there's still that Uro attack, and Paulo just gets to plan around this Shark Typhoon that he's drawn.
Yeah, and any additional instant speed cantrip also unlocks the 2 scries enabled by the Wilderness Reclamation. So this is, okay, both on bottom. Those don't do it.
Fabled Passage is literally blank at this point. All basics of Paulo's are on the battlefield.
We can cycle that Uro too. And we can escape it if we want to as well. There's more than enough cards in the graveyard at this point. Yes, he is sure. Thank you, though.
As a matter of fact, yes, I think I will. Is he thinking of putting the tapped one in the grave? Okay.
It works out the same either way, right? If you do plan to escape it.
Well, I wasn't sure if you get an extra escape. Look, there was a long pause there, is all I'm saying.
I mean, look, it's been a long day, and we have had rounds off in between. I dread to think what kind of mental state these 2 players are in at this point.
Well, Nightpack Ambusher's a blocker.
I guess. Is a blocker what he needs in this situation, though?
Well, no, but that is what that card does. That 2 more scries to the bottom.
Do we know what the count is of hard counter magic left in the deck?
Let's have a look really quick. Okay, so glancing over Paulo's deck list right now, I believe we're looking at Aether Gust.
Oh, Aether Gust. Negate for Autumn is a clutch draw here too.
Oh wow, is that just Paulo did gain a ton of life last turn. Without a Wilderness Reclamation, that explosion is no longer lethal.
Paulo has 12 lands in play. Or Autumn has 12 lands in play, sorry. So that's an explosion for 8, potentially, which is not actually enough to get this done here. So,
exactly.
And there's no Wilderness Reclamation, because the fight was fought and lost over that in the previous turn.
Correct, right.
So Paulo is not out of this yet. This isn't, his defenses are down, but that doesn't actually matter here.
No, this is a position where Autumn would basically need to find a Wilderness Reclamation off the top here. And, you know, they've got a couple of looks at it if Apollo puts the shields down. It is unreal how frequently these players just don't have to block Uro and do not care. Truly remarkable. Cantripping for a cantrip, not really what you want to be doing at this phase of the game.
And I have no horse in this race, but I'm rooting for a game three here. A game three here between these two players. You know, if there's anything approaching this caliber,
I know what. Oh yeah. Yeah, I would love to see game number 3 if it is anything like this one.
This is a measly 10-10 shark. Am I meant to be impressed by that?
Ooh, Aether Gust for Paulo is a way to actually check an explosion here.
And Wilderness Reclamation enables another set of scries if we're in the market for that.
There's just so much selection here. When you have multiple Wilderness Reclamations, this deck just goes. Do we know how many cards are in Paulo's deck? Because I feel like we just saw him scry a Wilderness Reclamation to the bottom.
Is there an easy way for us to identify that on the interface?
I'm not positive.
Also,
I'm sure they'll mouse over their graveyard at some point.
We'll worth noting here, the timers have appeared. We're down to 6.5 minutes on one side, getting down to 7:30 on the other side. So if we do get a third game, there's not going to be much time for thought if it's anything near as long as this one.
No, I mean, it can't be as long as this one. That's just not... That's out of the question.
That's not how math works, so I'm told.
Look, I've never been the math part of the duo, so you're going to have to pick up that slack, or, you know... I'm not going to do it. That's all I'm saying.
I think we're getting a new entry in the best of SCG Tour playlist here.
I sure hope so. Look at this.
We want that one. One top, one bottom.
Oh my god.
One top, one bottom.
Oh, I think that's the last expansion explosion in Paulo's deck as well.
Yeah, so this is it.
And we see Autumn just lets the third Wilderness Reclamation resolve. Who cares? There is no difference between 45 and 60 mana.
And when this explosion gets negated, assuming it happens now, does Paulo have a way left to win?
Well, that's complicated. I assume it involves a large shark typhoon.
Right. I mean, we do have a large shark in play currently, but...
All right, let's see if he decides that this is enough. There's a not zero chance he just packs him up here. With the clock the way it is, it's hard to say what he thinks his outs are from this point. I believe this is his last expansion explosion in the deck. We see 2 of them in graveyard, one of them about to be countered. I believe he sideboarded the 4th one out.
Yeah, you don't want to get flooded on that card. It's something that only comes into play either in these elaborate stack fights or at a point where the game is handled in your favor. But here, he could really use that 4th copy in his deck.
Autumn tanking over this commence the end game, it appears. Firing off. Gotta feel like the coasts are clear, right?
I think so.
If there was another expansion explosion in Paulo's hand, he could have just used it to counter the first expansion, or to force through the first expansion through that negate for way less mana.
Yeah, and if Autumn knows Paolo's sideboarding strategy, then they know that there's no fear of explosion left anymore. You don't have to worry about that fight. And so cycling that Shark Typhoon to make a larger shark than the 10-10 on Paolo's side, that might be enough to mathematically lock Paolo out of the gate.
Right. It would not surprise me to see that type of line being taken here. Ooh, so Autumn only has 11 cards in library to Paolo's 18. So what happens when you get to attack with Uro more times?
Okay, there's Reclamation. And the Gust can delay an explosion for one turn, but not for anything more than that.
Right, and it looks like we see Paolo putting a stop on Autumn's second main phase, which makes me think that this Aether Gust is going to happen now, which Autumn can then Uro to just find it again. All right, the Uro, the draw, the Reclamation, the Resolution, the end step.
Okay, we've seen this song and dance before. Is this game finally, after all of this, is it about to end?
Are we going to all be released from this epic second game of the semifinals that Autumn forces to a Game 3 against Paulo Vitor Damo de Rosa with a timely explosion at the last second? Good Lord. And look, we see Paulo shoving that fourth expansion explosion back in the deck.
Anything, as we get a quick survey of these post-cyber configurations, anything that's worth noting either in general or in light of how that game played out?
So looking at Autumn's list, they only have one Night Pack Ambusher in their 75. So this could actually be tough for them to close out in 5 minutes. All right, we're going to see both players playing at a blistering pace here in the semifinals of the SCG Tour online qualifier. Both these players have locked up $500 for top fouring, but they are playing for an additional $300 if they make the finals, and if they win, they are going to double the amount of money that they have already won.
And we know we will be seeing both of these players back for our Season 1 Championship, where hopefully we get a rematch that can even be a pair limitation of this.
Right, and it's so easy to become involved in these. There are online challenges all throughout the week. You can play against the best of the best. And these players, they've already punched their tickets. So, you don't even necessarily have to go through these people to get to that SCG Tour Online Championship.
And so this is going to be blitz magic from this point. Both players moving at as fast a pace as they can, taking very aggressive lines to try and close this game out before their clocks expire. And this is part of the equation that they signed up for here, where we get such an epic Game 2 because it went so long and was so involved, so many decisions. And so that leaves both players with very little time to make those tough decisions here in Game 3.
Call this the shift enter. And Autumn with a couple of Shark Typhoons in their hand that actually allow them to start attacking here if they so choose.
Yeah, and honestly, that might be the line. Yeah, okay, here we go. 2-2 Shark. Let's do it.
Nothing matters in 4 minutes.
Yeah. Though Brazenborough potentially can trade with at least one half, and maybe even both halves of let's say both halves, 2 different Shark Typhoons.
Right. If you are just now tuning in, there are 2.5 minutes on PVDDR's clock, 3:48 on Autumn Burchett's. Both of these players, Mythic champions, MPL members, best in the world, playing the fastest Magic that they can to just try and lock up that finals berth this weekend.
After that incredible slugfest of a Game 2, we will have a champion here in the semifinals in a matter of minutes.
Exactly. Do not go anywhere. 5 minutes or less, y'all are going to see who ends up winning this after that absolute nail-biter of a game.
And this is part of the game too. You know, there's Magic where the game lasts for an hour and one tiny mistake is enough to cost you. And then there's Magic in 5 minutes where you have to make every decision purely based on instinct and quick calculations. And again, one small mistake can cost you.
Right. And, look at this. Paulo sticking Uro, Titan of Nature's Wrath, on the battlefield. This is exactly what he needs to happen to be able to win these quick games.
Like, all right, Autumn, I got an Uro. What you got?
Yep. I hope it's something better than this for your sake.
Now, Commence the Endgame is threatening to create a 7-7 under current conditions, which can trade with the Uro and then potentially win the game within the 3 minutes that Autumn has left available to them.
7 is several power. We're talking multiple power, multiple toughness, and this Uro needs to find something off the top immediately. Autumn double, triple checking that they want to commence here, that they don't just want to chump block this Uro. Because there is certainly a cost to eating that Uro here. You are putting the shields down. Good combat for Autumn. Dust settles, only that 7-7 remains. $1:48 on Paulo's clock, 2:25 on Autumn's.
And this is StarCraft Magic now. What's your APM like?
Well, Autumn's first action of the turn, putting Uro into the graveyard, another land onto the battlefield, shoving with this token, and they've drawn another Shark Typhoon.
And yeah, Autumn with a lot of the tools here, I think, to win this game, under normal time circumstances too. But
they just have to make the actions. Ooh, how do you feel about a commence the end game off the top?
Oh, the end game commenced minutes ago. We're long past that. I think the concept of an end game loses all meaning when you have a minute and a half left to end the game in.
Game 2, the Infinity War. Game 3, the end game.
And this is the best crossover episode of all time. Uro Titan of Nature's Wrath, one of the best cards in Standard, if not the best, and a zombie token that's somehow bigger than it.
Look, it is an army.
I guess.
It literally is an army. I don't know what to tell you.
Getting all literal with me over here. I guess in this case, reading the card does explain the card.
Is this a situation where it feels like to me Autumn is purposefully not playing cards that could be responded to with reactive spells in order to try and strand those Uros in Paulo's graveyard.
That would make a lot of sense. And yeah, after that
does it.
ridiculous marathon of a game